corn silage is actually two crops. We think of it as a homogeneous crop, and once it gets in the silo, it is, but it really is two crops growing in the field. It's a high-quality grain, and it's a rather modest quality tropical grass. Your corn silage quality depends to a great extent on the relative proportion of these two crops. The more grain you have, for the most part, the higher your quality is going to be. But until recently, most of your silage quality improvement has been increasing through increasing the grain to stock ratio. And I think we should give credit to our plant breeders, not only from Mycogen, but throughout the industry, in the wonderful job that they have done over the years in simply hanging a better ear off of that corn stalk. And they have changed not only the size of the ear in a lot of cases, but they've changed the whole conformation of the kernels in terms of deeper kernels. And we've increased the shelling percent, for instance. In other words, the percentage of cob to grain that we have. Back in the old days, I remember some of the old hybrids we had that had up to 24 rows of kernels around. A big fat ear, but with a big fat cob. That 18,000 plants per acre did pretty well, and that 24,000 plants per acre just blew apart, and we had barren plants and all sorts of problems. And so the plant breeders have done a really great job of this, of taking us to where we are now. But a good ear is really a farmer's crop insurance, because weather does have a great effect on stover. Hot and wet is good for yield, but bad for fiber digestibility. Cool and dry is not quite so good for yield, but it results in high digestibility. And of those two, moisture stress is much more of a negative factor than is temperature, probably 3 times more of a factor. And so that's the reason why, depending on the kind of weather we have, unless we're in an area where we irrigate corn and we essentially can make our weather, and that's the reason why we really have to focus on this. And I think it's one of the reasons why we have a lot more of an emphasis on fiber digestibility and doing all of these analyses in the eastern half of the United States than we do out in the western portion, because in a lot of cases they have more control over that big variable, in other words, precipitation, because in a lot of cases they are providing the precipitation through irrigation. And so weather influences the quantity of grain on a corn plant, but it doesn't have a lot of effect on grain quality, because grain only has somewhere around 5% fiber. And so if you get hot and wet, it will affect the fiber digestibility of the stover, but it won't have a lot of effect on the grain. And so that's the reason why you really need to start with a good ear. Now, we have had some attempts over the last 10 years by some seed companies to produce corn hybrids that are high digestibility, but also high in fiber. They have superior fiber digestibility. One of them was tested by Cornell University a few years ago, had the lowest percent of grain to stalk that they had ever tested, somewhere around 30% grain to stalk ratio. And that hybrid, if you had a good year for silage production, in other words, not a lot of excess moisture, did really well. But then you'd have another year where it was hot and wet, and farmers growing that hybrid had a tremendous problem with it. And so you really need to pay attention to the ear. And so high quality corn silage starts with a good ear. That's my first take-home point. I really like this little graph. Comes right out of the Midwest here, and it's a relationship of corn forage in vitro digestibility and for whole plant and stover. And look at the bottom of the chart, over 100 years. Now this is current through the 1990s, but if you take a look and see, I mean, the good news is that whole plant digestibility has been increasing pretty steadily over the past 100 years. Part of that is due to the plant breeders. Part of that's due to you guys doing a better job of growing corn. You've improved your management, you've improved your yields, and had a more consistent crop. But But folks, look at what's happened to stover digestibility over the 100 years. Basically nothing. Because the emphasis on plant breeders has been on that ear. And why? Because the United States, in spite of those of us in the dairy business, is grain focused. And so that's where the effort has been. And you could almost make a case that stover digestibility has decreased over the years, but I'm not sure that's the case. And I think if we were to put another little block in here for the 2000s, it might bump up a little bit. But I want you to understand that if you just buy the best and brightest grain hybrid that company has out for 2009, and expect because it's their best and newest grain hybrid that fiber digestibility or stover digestibility is going to be better. Well, not necessarily, because stover digestibility just hasn't had much change, and this is in the dual-purpose hybrids. If you're going to get big increases in stover digestibility, in a lot of cases, it's something that you have to look at, something that plant breeders have focused on. So let's first look at dual-purpose hybrids. They are developed primarily for grain harvest, and there's not a lot of difference in the stover digestibility in dual-purpose hybrids. There are exceptions, but in general, if you take a look at university-done corn silage hybrid trials, and you take a look at the digestibility of the dual-purpose hybrids, typically you will only see a difference of a few points from the top to the bottom in fiber digestibility. You may see a significantly more difference in total digestibility, in other words, in dry matter digestibility, when we take that ear into account. But just in stover digestibility, usually a few points pretty well covers it. The one thing we have going for us here is that universities as well as seed companies have done a lot better job in the past 5 years or so in evaluating the commercial hybrids that are out there in terms of digestibility. So we have a lot more data to go on, replicated data that's done under pretty good conditions. And as I said, some dual-purpose hybrids do have very good digestibility and some do not. But a lot of your quality differences are related to grain content. And I would rely on the company trials, because they will extensively test their lineup to sort out the best and the brightest of their lineup. And then rely on the university trials to essentially sort out the best of all. And fortunately, in most dairy areas, we do have state universities involved in silage testing, and these results are published. A lot of them are available either from Extension or on the web or both. One of the problems or situations we have is that corn silage is still, in spite of those of us in the dairy industry, it's still a minor crop. On the average, there's only about 7% of corn in the U.S. that's harvested for silage. And of that, some of that is corn for grain that's gone bad, something that happened and the farmer said, well, I can't harvest it for grain, I'm going to harvest it for silage. And with recent events in terms of ethanol and very high grain prices, I think if we were to actually look at the percentage of the corn crop in the U.S. in 2008 harvested for silage, I think probably it might be in the vicinity of 5%. So 1 unit of seed out of 20 is being harvested for silage. And is it any wonder why a lot of seed companies have not placed a big focus on silage production? And there's a big difference in the way that various seed companies have looked at this. Mycogen, in one case, is a company that's looked very seriously at this, putting a lot of their resources into this. I looked at another seed catalog a couple of years ago, a regional seed company right from here in the Midwest, and I looked very carefully through their seed catalog, and the word silage did not appear in that seed catalog. Now, what do you think that company's commitment to corn silage is? Well, it's basically zero. That doesn't mean it's a bad company. It's probably a very good company. But their focus is entirely on grain production. And we need to take these things into consideration. It's very possible that some of that company, that company's hybrids may have pretty decent silage digestibility, maybe good silage hybrid. It's just that we don't know, because they're not they're not testing in the regional university trials. Let's look at leafy hybrids. Leafy hybrids are most of them are silage only, not all. There are some leafy hybrids that are dual-purpose hybrids, and they have up to twice as many leaves. And all leaves are above the ear. And the advantage of that is that's where farmers can see. Because anything a farmer can see from the pickup truck seat without having to get out has additional value. And a farmer walking through the field, a lot of times he's looking like this. He's not looking like this. So anything that's above the ear has additional value. And they really are showy. I mean, leafy hybrids under good growing conditions, in some cases, not only are there more leaves, but the leaves are actually wider. And that's not an opinion, that's a fact. I've gone out and measured some of these, and in some cases, they're maybe a half an inch wider. Half an inch may not sound like a lot, but it does make a difference. My son used to be a crops consultant, and he said it should be illegal for a farmer to plant leafy corn hybrids in narrow rows, because he used to have to go out to scout those. And he said that is cruel and unusual punishment to have to do that. But the thing is, leaves don't add a lot to forage quality. They're not the highest quality part of the corn plant. And they only represent, 10 or so percent of yield. So if you have 20% more leaves, that's 20%, 10%, so you're only gaining a couple percent in yield for leafies. And so with a lot of leafies, there's essentially more there than meets the eye, is because they look really good from the eye. Now, and some leafy hybrids are excellent. Some of them combine good silage quality, a really good ear, and high yield. But I think you make your purchase decisions based on yield and quality, not on whether the hybrid is leafy or not. And we have a leafy hybrid. We grew quite an acreage of leafy hybrid at the Institute this year, but it was not because it was leafy. It was because in the Cornell University trials, it was a real outstanding hybrid for yield and for corn silage quality. So we bought it because it was a top hybrid. We didn't buy it because it was leafy. And this is not particularly good corn, but it just gives you an idea. This is out of the same field in a strip trial we did some years ago. And this hybrid has 5 leaves above the ear. This one has 8 or 9 leaves above the ear. I have seen as many as 12 leaves, all of them above the ear. And that is really, really bushy corn. Most leafy hybrids aren't premium priced. Most of them are comparably priced to other hybrids. And yield is comparable to dual-purpose hybrids. There is no particular yield advantage to leafies. And why should there be? As I just said, because the leaves only represent 10% of yield. In terms of quality, it depends from hybrid to hybrid. You can't say that leafies are generally higher in quality. One University of Wisconsin trial with a leafy hybrid did find a response of a couple pounds per cow versus a comparable non-leafy, but I think in a lot of cases that may be the exception to the rule. One thing that has more recently come to light, and I think may be important, is that some, not all, but a significant portion of leafy hybrids have a wider harvest window. In other words, from the time they get to 30% whole plant dry matter till the time they get to 35% whole plant dry matter takes a few more days. Okay? And it essentially holds in that ideal corn silage quality or dry matter range. My preference is in the 33-35% range. Now, is this important to you? Well, if you have 30 acres of corn and you can harvest it all in 2 days, who cares? You can afford to choose the ideal time. But if you have a lot of corn and it's going to take you a long time to harvest, or if you have your corn custom harvested, and the guy that chops your corn may not always be there on the day that you want him to be, that could be a significant advantage. And what I would do is I would talk to your seed company about his or her particular lineup of leafy corn, because, as I said, not all leafy hybrids have this characteristic, but there's enough of them that do. I think you should pay attention. But the bottom line is, leafy hybrids have great sex appeal. I mean, they just look great. And sex sells, whether it's in the movie theater or whether it's in the cornfield. And that's the reason why the percentage of seed sales of leafy corn hybrids in North America has been steadily on the increase, because they simply have good eye appeal. Then there's BMR. These are silage-only hybrids. To my knowledge, there's no BMR that is recommended as dual purpose. And BMR is mostly sold by Mycogen Seeds. I can't say it's only sold by Mycogen anymore, because it's not. The Long Island Cauliflower Association, LICA, that now has a few BMR hybrids, and we may be seeing more of them on the market, because the BMR gene, the BM3 gene, is not patented. The brown midrib gene was found in the 1920s in Minnesota. It's been kicking around for a long time. There's lots of different brown midrib genes, but the BM3 one seems to be the one that has the best combination of yield and quality. BMR continues to be a relatively small part of the total corn silage market, but it is an important one, and it's worth some discussion. The BMR gene causes incomplete lignin formation. And so BMR hybrids are almost always lower in lignin than non-BMR hybrids. We have done replicated research trials at Minor Institute comparing Leafy, BMR, and the dual-purpose hybrid, and we're finding a couple percent lower lignin levels in BMR. But while lignin is indigestible, so low lignin increases digestibility, lignin is what keeps plants standing erect. And so if you have a hybrid which has low lignin, there is the potential for increased problems with standability. Farmers call it lodging. We agronomists like to call it a horizontal growth characteristic. And so you do have that potential, and that you need to acknowledge. Much of the benefit of BMR is from increased dry matter intake. And that's the reason why it's especially good for high corn silage diets. It's especially good for higher producing cows. We've had a number of years of experience with BMR at the Institute. It worked really well for us, but we are the type of herd that you would expect it to work better given the situation, because corn silage is about 2/3 of our forage dry matter. So we're a high corn silage ration, and our herd average is right around 30,000 pounds a cow on 320 cows. And so we do have enough cows in our high group, enough cows that are making milk to benefit from it. But we'll get into that in just a bit. BMR is brown midrib, and the midribs aren't really brown. They're kind of an orangish color. That's a BMR one, and that's a BMR one. I think you can see the orangish color right there. That's a non-BMR. But to identify it in the field, frankly, I think in a lot of cases, if you take a look at the back of the leaf where it joins the stem, and with BMR, you see this little brownish or orangish dot on the plant. And non-BMR do not have that coloration. And it's just one way that if you're in the field and you're trying to remember whether it's BMR or not, that's one way that you can remember it. BMR hybrids in the field. As I said before, lower lignin means potential standability problems. But we have had very few standability problems in the 5 years that we've grown BMR at Minor Institute, but we don't push maturity. We try to make sure that by the time that plant is pushing 35% dry matter, we're in the field chopping it. So standability has not been a problem for us, but it is a situation that needs to be managed. You have to acknowledge that it is a potential. BMR hybrids have poor drought and disease resistance. You do not want to plant them on droughty land. And this is one of the things that Mycogen has been quite clear in advising its clientele that you do not want to put this on poor land. It likes good fertility. Therefore, the closer you plant it to the dairy barn, the happier you probably will be with it. And we have tested this on our farm inadvertently by putting it on land which is near the farm and has good fertility and has good moisture holding capacity, and it does extremely well. It's quite competitive in yield with our non-BMR hybrids. But when we try to stretch that out and put that on some leased land, that stuff that's had renter's disease over the years, a different person renting it each year, and how much manure or fertilizer do you think it gets? Well, we purchased one of those farms and we're leasing another. And so about half our land is that kind of land. And when we put BMR on that kind of land, we are taking more of a yield hit. So that's a hybrid that you just have to acknowledge that has to be properly positioned. And there's not a lot of controversy about this. I mean, it is good soil. It's a good soil hybrid is what it is. Yields historically have been somewhere between 5 and 20% lower than non-BMR hybrids. Some of the newer hybrids appear to be closing this difference. And I think with the newer hybrids, we're probably in the 10% or less yield difference. Historically at the Institute, we've done a little bit of research on this, but most of what I'm going to say is based on just field-to-field comparisons that we have done, which are not research. They're simply field-to-field comparisons. And over the years, we're seeing about a 10% difference between BMR and non-BMR. Now, please understand, BMR does not have a low ceiling in terms of yield. We have harvested 23, 24 tons per acre of BMR in a good year on a good field. And long-term silage yields on our farm are averaging about 20 tons an acre. So under good conditions, it has a capability for high yield, but it has to be properly positioned. It has about 1/3 higher seed price than most non-BMR hybrids. And the good news is that now some of the newer BMR hybrids are coming with added traits. The bad news is that those added traits are coming at an added cost. But we have to look at this pretty carefully because, on the one hand, if you're adding BT, you're going to be paying significantly more per unit for it, but you can't attribute all of this to seed costs. Certainly, you're going to be paying a little bit more to Mycogen or whoever you're buying the traded seed, but think about the fact that then you're going to be buying less soil insecticide if, for instance, you're going to be starting to control corn rootworms genetically rather than with a soil insecticide. And I frankly think that farmers, through their normal amount of moaning and whining about early pay and early order discounts and all, usually have better results in getting a really good deal on seed orders than they do on reduced pesticide cost, insecticide cost. So I think there's a lot more attractive early order, early pay discounts on these traits than there is on insecticides. It may make a few bucks a difference per acre, but all seed cost is going up. I mean, we're going to see some non-BMR seed this year that's, according to what I hear, that's going to be over $300 a unit. And I think this spring especially, this spring of '09 especially, we're going to, maybe for the first time, see something kind of interesting happen. We're going to see one of these guys with multi-traded seed that's going to be in a fairly old corn planter, and he's going to be driving to the field. And the cost of the seed in that corn planter is going to exceed the value of the corn planter itself. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing when you consider the benefit he's going to be getting out of these traits. And I will tell you at the Institute, we bought a new corn planter 2 years ago. It does not have insecticide boxes on it. We intend on controlling corn rootworms on our farm by a combination of the high rate of the pre-treatments, Cruiser Extreme or Poncho, the 1250 rate of that, or with genetics. And we are just not going to be using soil insecticides anymore. Don't put BMR and non-BMR hybrids in the same field. It's okay to blend BMR and non-BMR corn silage in the ration, and we have been doing that at the Institute, partially because early on we didn't have enough brown rib to feed all we wanted to all the cows we wanted, so we were blending it. But our dairy nutritionists, even today, and we have a lot of BMR on the farm, they are still blending in some non-BMR, but they're able to do it in an intelligent way. You don't want to do it in the same field because there are maturity differences, and you just can't go in and with any great deal of assurance say, I'm going to put this hybrid and this hybrid in the field, and they're supposedly rated both, let's say, at 100 days relative maturity, and so they're going to both reach 33% dry matter at the same time. They may not. And I had a good friend in Western New York who insisted that he was going to try this, and he put in a BMR and a non-BMR. I think he had a 12-row planter, and so he put 6 rows of each in, so he was harvesting 12 rows at a time as he went, up and back with the with his chopper. And the problem was, when he got in there, there was a big, at maturity, there was a big difference between the BMR and the non-BMR hybrid. And it was a real pain in the neck for him to harvest. So it's fine to blend it in the ration, but don't try to plant them in the same field because of the possible problems in maturity. But BMR in the feed bunk, it just has higher digestibility and higher dry matter intake than any other corn hybrid you can find. That's the bottom line on BMR. It has a positive milk response even with cows that are milking over 100 pounds. Early on in the days of BMR, when Cargill still was doing all the work with BMR, Mike Allen at Michigan State did one of the early trials on BMR. And he did it with a group of cows averaging 108 pounds a cow. He fed them BMR and got a statistically significant increase in production. I mean, think about, the challenges of taking a cow making over 100 pounds of milk, a group of cows averaging over 100 pounds of milk, and increasing production economically. The BMR is one thing that will do that. But that is not characteristic only of BMR, folks. That is characteristic of any high digestibility hybrid. Several years ago, Miner Institute did some research with a Syngenta hybrid that had high silage digestibility. We compared it with a Syngenta hybrid that did not have as high a silage digestibility, and we got a several pound response per cow when we fed those in a switchback design to groups of cows. But then we started going in and sorting out the individual cows. And the higher the daily milk production of the cow, the greater the pounds of increase in milk we got in feeding that high digestibility hybrid. But guys, doesn't that make sense? Because you get a cow that's making 130, 140 pounds of milk. What is one of your major challenges? Intake of high quality feed, dry matter intake. And BMR, basically every study they do with BMR, they do get higher DMI with BMR. It's a great feed for transition and fresh cows. Our Cargill representative, or one of the people that we work with on nutrition on our program, said, if I was limited in the amount of BMR I had on the farm, I wouldn't feed it to the high group cows. I'd feed it to those transition cows, and as they freshen, push their rate of BMR, drive them to a higher peak, and then if I'm limited, I'd stop feeding BMR when they peaked. And then go back to the dual purpose or the Leafy or whatever other hybrid that they have that does not have that fiber digestibility. And he said then they're at a higher peak to begin with, and then they will assume a normal lactation curve. And he's talking about like 60 to 90 days of feeding, achieving a lot of the total increase in milk production that in a lot of cases we're getting with BMR. And so there's just different ways to do it. That's not what we're doing on our farm. We're feeding it to those cows, but we're also feeding it to high group cows. We're feeding it to about 3 of the production group cows on production groups on our farm. So there's different avenues to success with it. But understand that there is not a lot of benefit when fed to non-milking heifers that are not in that transition area and cows that are further down the lactation curve. I mean, it depends on who you talk to in terms of getting the flavor of this. But generally somewhere between 60, 70 pounds of milk is where I think is, for Holsteins, is where I think the cutoff is in terms of whether it's economical or not. That depends on the farm. It depends on what your yields are, what your cost per ton of corn silage is, what the difference in yield between BMR and non-BMR is on your farm. I mean, many different factors go into making that final decision, but based on our experience on our farm over the 5 years, I really think that the cutoff would be somewhere in the 60 to 70 pounds. Now here's an average of 18 field and lactation trials. And I think that's important that we're looking actual lactation trials. So when we're looking at milk per ton and milk per acre, we're just not looking at Wisconsin's Milk 2000 and Milk 2006 program. We're looking at actual cow response data. I believe that one of those 18 trials was one done at Minor Institute a few years ago, comparing BMR and non-BMR. And you can see the average of 18 trials. You can see the yield. And what I've done is I've taken non-BMR and I've put the non-BMR at basically 100%, so expressing BMR as a percentage of that. And you can see that's 18 trials. That's about a 7% difference in yield. I think that's quite consistent with what I've been saying. That yields are anywhere 5 to 20% lower, 20% under dry, low fertility conditions, 5% under good conditions, and I think 7% is. I could agree with that. ADF and NDF, you'll see fiber levels are a little lower. You may be surprised at that, but I'm not, because historically the net energy of BMR hybrids on our farm, BMR silage on our farm, has consistently been higher than non-BMR. And so it don't, just because I've been saying that it's 5 to 10% lower yield, don't assume it's a poorly eared hybrid. It's not. It's not. And you have increased milk per ton of about 5% and decreased milk per acre of a few percent. That doesn't mean that's always going to happen. I've seen a couple trials done by the universities where they've actually wound up with a little bit more milk per acre with BMR than with non-BMR. But on the average, it's a trade-off, a little bit less milk per acre, more milk in every bite. But BMR is not for all dairy farms. I'm not going to stand up here and tell you that it is one flavor for everybody. Lower yield and higher seed cost make BMR corn more expensive per ton and for every bite your cows take. It needs to be segregated since, as I said before, it's not cost effective for heifers and for low-producing cows. It's really a good fit for larger herds that can have a silo just for BMR. On our farm, we've got 2 stacks and 7 bunker silos. And we also have ag bags, mostly for research. And we fill 2 bunker silos with brown midrib. And so we essentially can be feeding brown midrib year-round, but those silos only have BMR in them. Trying to stack BMR on top of a BMR is not recommended because, in general, you're not going to get an even stack and an even pack. And in a lot of cases, you're going to be feeding a little bit different ratio of BMR to non-BMR just about every day or every week, and it's going to drive your dairy nutrition person nuts. So don't do it. Silage bags are a great tool for that. If you can figure out some way to keep the raccoons and the rats and the mice and the kids and the dogs and everything else that seems to walk over one of those things, and how the raccoons can sort out a silage bag with corn silage versus a silage bag with haylage so quickly and so effectively is a continuing mystery to me, but they do. The other thing is that lower yield and higher dry matter intake means that you may need more acres of corn because you will have higher dry matter intake. You can go to the bank on that. And chances are you will have slightly lower yield, at least if you look at the research that's been done in the past, a few percent lower yield. So you're going to need more corn acres. And so if land is limiting for you, I mean, that may be a factor that discourages it. In most cases, I don't think it will be, but we need to recognize that. And this kind of summarizes the grain versus BMR versus leafy hybrid thing. And this is an average of a number of trials. And as you can see, as I said before, there's not a lot of difference in fiber digestibility between the average grain hybrid and the average leafy hybrid. You buy a leafy hybrid because that particular hybrid has the yield and quality characteristics you want, not because it's leafy, unless sex appeal appeals to you. In that case, buy 1 unit and plant 8 rows around the field. Okay? And then, you know, and then you can put the BMR inside the field if it embarrasses you to have corn that's not leafy. Okay? But look at the difference in BMR. They're looking at a difference of about 12 percentage points. I fully subscribe to that. At the Institute, we do a lot of in vitros. We have our own lab. And I just for the heck of it, just before I came to this meeting, I reviewed the past 3 years of 30-hour in vitros between the average corn silage that we have and the average BMR corn silage on our farm, and our long-term average is 13 points difference. Okay, 13 points higher NDFD at 30-hour, and I think that's very consistent with this. Okay, let's move away from that particular hybrid thing for just a bit as we're kind of winding down here. How many hybrids should you plant for silage? Now, I'm the crops guy. They call me the crops dude on the Institute farm. And even though I'm partially retired, I'm still involved in seed orders and planting rotations and things like this on the farm, mostly because the Institute has been a complete failure in trying to find somebody to take over my job. And they're always whining about changes in silage quality. What they would really like is to have the silo that starts out the same digestibility, and then at the end of the silo winds up the same digestibility, same protein, everything. Well, lots of luck, guys, because one thing we're learning increasingly is there's big changes in silage quality, both in protein degradability and in starch digestibility as you go from 2 to 4 to 6 to 8 months out. And if you're testing your hybrids for digestibility in October when you open a silo and then you don't check it again until the next October, you're missing the boat. Because that crop is different in March than it is in October. And it is a lot different in March than it is in October. And that's not an opinion. That's based on research done on a bunch of silos in Europe and also done right here in the Midwest. But, you know, how many hybrids to plant? Obviously, it depends on your corn acreage and your desire for multiple seed caps and seed jackets. I mean, when I see a grass farmer and I see him with a pioneer hat or something like this, I figure he's probably won that as a door prize or something like that. Because grass farmers, it may be profitable, but they don't get free caps or free jackets or anything like that. It's a real drag. So if you have 100 acres of corn, maybe 2 hybrids, 4 or 5 isn't too many. Depends on your particular situation. But if you put 1,000 acres in, that doesn't mean you put 20 or 30 in. That gets kind of ridiculous, doesn't it? So you have to use common sense. I would say that if planting and harvest can each be accomplished typically in a week or so, you don't need as many hybrids. And they can be of similar relative maturity. In other words, all 100, 105-day relative maturity, if you're going to be aiming for 32 to 35% harvest dry matter. And differences of 3-4 points in harvest dry matter, your dairy nutritionist is going to be able to deal with that pretty well. But if planting for you starts in May and winds up well into June, or if you have a custom harvester then you have a custom harvester that comes in with his 6-row chopper and 5 trucks and yanks everything off the farm in 3 days, maybe take a little different look at hybrid selection. You may want to use hybrids that have a wider range of dry matter, a wider range of relative maturity, I should say. In other words, maybe 95 to 105. So it depends on how efficiently you plant, and it depends on how efficiently you get that crop off. And we have an increasing percent of our crop in the United States that's harvested by custom operators, and we need to think about that. One of the challenges I think we have is slowing some of these guys down so that we can keep up with packing with the available packing tractors we have. And you get a guy that used to grow 100 acres of corn, and he used to chop with a 2-row chopper, and he packed with a 40-20. And now he's growing 300 acres of corn. A custom operator's coming in, harvesting the whole thing in a day and a half, and he's still packing with a 40-20. It's not good enough. The guys on our farm occasionally get a little pissed off at me because if we're chopping close to home, I make them park one of the trucks because they can harvest a lot faster than we can pack, even with 2 big tractors on the stack at all times. And so we use one more truck if we're further from home than we do close to. And don't forget that point, because that is a growing problem. We are seeing more problems with inadequate packing as we go to more custom harvest. Just for point of reference, 2008 we had a little over 300 acres of corn, 105 acres of 1-BMR hybrid, mycogen 485. We get about a 5-pound milk response from feeding BMR. We did a replicated trial some years ago comparing BMR, Leafy, and dual purpose. We got 5.1 pounds, and that was based on very accurately done records. Since then, we have not done a lot of research on it, but there's been 2 times that we've run out of BMR, and our cows go down by 5 pounds. Then we start feeding BMR again, and they increase by 5 pounds. Well, that's not research. That means something to us. And the average, about 15 points higher in 30-hour NDF. That's with the hybrids that we are harvesting now. As I said a few minutes ago, I looked at the previous 3 or 4 years, and the average is about 13 percentage points. We've got 85 acres of 1 Leafy hybrid, not because it's leafy, but because, as I said at the beginning of my presentation, because it was superior in yield and quality in a couple of the Cornell trials, including one that was done right on our farm. And then we've got 115 acres of 2 dual-purpose hybrids. So even though I have not spent a lot of time on dual-purpose compared to the other characteristics, we are planting more dual-purpose than any other specific hybrid type on our farm. But again, that is based primarily on Cornell University silage trial performance. It has the combination of yield and quality that we're looking for. And there's certainly a place for all of those. Our nutritionists would like to have just 1 hybrid and so that they have uniform quality, but the reality is the range of planting dates, soil types, and soil fertility from field to field will usually result in corn silage that's not nearly uniform, even if you only use 1 hybrid. Greg Roth at Penn State, a couple of years ago, reported to me a farmer that was buying corn silage that was being custom grown for him, and he really wanted his silage to be very uniform. It was a big operation with big fields, and so he figured there wouldn't be a lot of variation because there weren't a lot of fields involved. So he put 1 hybrid in. The guy got it all in pretty good order, got it all off in pretty good order, and he was really discouraged to see the variation in quality in that corn silage. And that's something that we just have to live with, that there's within field differences in soil drainage, moisture, fertility, soil type, whatever, that it's not going to be a 100% uniform crop. Planting more than 1 hybrid does spread the risk if a particular hybrid turns out to be highly susceptible to drought, disease, insects, and things like this. And this still does happen. The plant breeders have done a very good job of making our hybrids basically resistant to a lot of bad things that can happen, but that does not mean that they are immune. And so I would feel very cautious about putting a whole farm into 1 hybrid. If corn planting is spread over several weeks, putting the same hybrid from first field to last may result in unacceptable differences in silage dry matter. I mentioned that just a few minutes ago. Here's an interesting one that we didn't even talk about a couple years ago, and that is that some of these insect resistance traits, Bt corn borer, Bt corn rootworm, they're simply resulting in healthier plants. The plants are remaining green and juicy later into the season. And a live plant is a juicy plant. It retains more moisture later into the growing season. Is that an opinion? No, it's a fact. Cornell University found that Bt hybrids at silage harvest moistures were 2 to 3 percentage points wetter, lower in dry matter, in other words, than non-BT hybrids, the isoline. In other words, the same genetics minus the traits. So they were comparing pretty close to being apples and apples. And they were consistently running 2 to 3 percentage points. Now, think about that. That means if you're aiming at 32 with a non-traded, or with a traded, with a non-traded, that your traded seed might be 29 or 30. And there is a difference in effluent production between 29 and 32. So you really might take this into account, especially if you mix BT and non-BT in the same field. And in terms of planting the required refuge acres, a lot of farmers are putting the BT and non-BT, the same basic genetics, in the same field, planting 20% or so of the non-BT. And you may need to think about that, because that BT may turn out to be 2 or 3 points wetter. And that's something that's, I think, is fairly consistent. And since we're going to have an increasing reliance on these multiply insect-resistant hybrids, something you may want to think about as you're planning for the following year. So in summary, first, don't assume that the newest hybrids have better digestibility. Some do, some don't. Rely on yield data, that which is provided by the seed companies with which you do business, and also by the universities that are doing replicated studies. And I think you're in good shape here in the Midwest, as we are in much of the Northeast, in having information which is locally done under farm conditions, coming up with high-quality information. Most improvements in dual-purpose hybrids, these are the hybrids that are primarily used for grain, has been the grain, hanging a better ear off of each plant at higher populations. We're now able to get very good ear-to-stalk ratio at harvest populations well over 30,000 pounds an acre. And plant breeders have done a great job of this, but you guys have also done a better job of growing this terrific crop. Leafies are a good option if they have superior yield and digestibility. Some do, some don't. Rely on trial data to make that decision, not on how it looks growing in the field, because you can't tell a 10% difference in yield from the pickup truck seat, boys and girls. You may think you can, but you can't. And last but not least, BMR is not for all farms and not for all cows on a farm. It needs to be stored in a separate silo, and top-notch field and herd management are a must. This is not the technology for the farmer who is aiming at being just okay. Done right, it will put milk in the tank. Put enough different hybrids in to accommodate your harvest schedule and reduce risk, but don't go crazy. And balance the relative maturity of hybrids with your planting and your harvest schedules. I get really nervous at people that aim for 30% dry matter, folks. And I think those of us in agronomy circles, in some cases, have really done you guys a disservice by saying that 30% dry matter is the gold standard for corn silage dry matters. It is not. And you will reliably gain milk production per ton and milk production per acre by aiming for 33 to 35% dry matter, especially if you have a processor. If you're in an upright silo without a processor, maybe 32 or something like this. And I think there's a couple points difference that you have to play around with whether you process or not. But 30% is not the gold standard. There are meaningful differences in milk production ability of these hybrids at 33 to 35% dry matter versus at 30. The corn plant is changing very rapidly day by day as you go from 30 to 35. I would rather miss it. We have a processor on the farm. We put everything in bunker silos or in stacks. I would rather miss 2 points high than 2 points low. I am much less concerned about 37% dry matter if I'm aiming for 35 and get 37, much less than if I'm aiming for 33 and wind up with 30 to 31. And BT hybrids may be a few points wetter at harvest because the plants are healthy. In other words, it's a positive characteristic these plants have, but it's one you need to think about. And with that, I have 10 minutes or so, and I'll open it up to any questions.